Good point. Thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. And then to close things out so we both don't hold up the Senate, Senator Lee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Delrahim, getting back to you, covering some of the themes we talked about earlier about instances in which the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission sometimes take divergent views. They sometimes take different paths, one deciding to withdraw merger guidelines, the other not. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. No one would ever envision the Catholic Church being successful if it had two popes serving simultaneously in the exact same position. We would never dream of having two presidents of the United States serving simultaneously. This sort of two-headed monster phenomenon is a recipe for disaster. And that's why I've long advocated for choosing one or the other. Pick a horse and ride it, as my former boss, Paul Warner, used to say. As I look to which horse we ought to ride, all things being equal, I think it ought to go to the Department of Justice. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, it's set up in such a way that it is more politically accountable. It's run by people who are appointed by the president and after Senate confirmation serve at the pleasure of the president. And its overall structure is also just generally better suited for decisive enforcement of the sort that's necessary to protect American consumers. Moreover, given criminal ramifications of some of our antitrust laws, it's important to put it in an entity that has criminal law enforcement authority. The Department of Justice has that, the Federal Trade Commission, not so much. So the One Agency Act would do this. It would consolidate antitrust authority in one agency, in the Department of Justice. Mr. Delrahim, what do you think of the, first of all, the wisdom or lack thereof of having two separate entities, and second, the idea that if you're going to pick a horse, it ought to be the Department of Justice?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I am no longer in an administration where I needed OMB approval. I may cause other problems by my comments here. I think that even other countries, China recently combined its three agencies into one and a half. There's great efficiencies in the administration of justice, especially when we're talking about law enforcement. Here, you have, for a number of reasons, you mentioned it, why I think the DOJ is better. You have one decision maker. We've had issues in past, Microsoft case at the FTC was one, Google was another, where you have a tie, or you have litigation where one commissioner writes an amicus to a judge who is really not comfortable with this stuff anyways. And it's like, wait a minute, your commission is bringing a lawsuit and one of your commissioners is writing a perfectly legible argument why it's bad? How am I supposed to decide this? You have a decision maker. If Mr. Cantor, for example, is recused, then the Attorney General steps in, or the Deputy Attorney General, and you can make a decision and enforce the law in a predictable way. I think, bringing the Federal Trade Commission, wonderful entity, taking the Bureau of Competition only, putting it in the Antitrust Division, and I actually think you might have this opportunity because the Supreme Court's going to review the constitutionality of the CFPB next year. And, who knows where that goes? If I were a betting man, I would vote against the constitutionality of its current structure. So, if you want to keep the CFPB and let it survive, it enforces the same exact law as Section 5. Why not take the CFPB, put it in this FTC? While you're at it, it's created some more taxpayer savings. Take the CPSC, so you have one consumer protection agency, one antitrust agency that actually administers the law, and a much more, nobody loses a job, maybe a couple of politically appointed commissioners. That would make a lot of sense as a government design, and I think it would create efficiencies in the government that would benefit everybody involved. So that's one suggestion, and for a number of reasons, I think the Justice Department is the better place. As I mentioned, most important is the fact that you have one decision maker. It's a law enforcement. You have the chief law enforcer making that decision.
So not just efficiency, but also increased certainty and enhanced accountability.
Due process.
Hardly sounds radical to me, coupled with due process. Ms. Slayman, we often expect vertical integration in most markets to have at least some potential to create efficiencies, increased efficiencies of the sort that could benefit consumers in the right set of circumstances. And that often is the case, but it's certainly not always the case. Where there are substantial barriers to entry and where there are switching costs, for instance, it can also lead to foreclosure that keeps competition at bay, that keeps competition out. And to that extent, it can have the ability to either entrench or expand, or in some cases even confer monopoly power. How has this worked out in ad tech?
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Lee. I just want to very briefly respond about the importance of having both the FTC and the Department of Justice enforcing antitrust law. I could spend a lot of time on this, and I won't since you didn't ask me. One of the reasons is it's very useful to have competition and consumer protection working together under one roof, because there are important synergies between the two. But I'll focus on your question. The DoubleClick merger in 2007, as you have mentioned and Senator Klobuchar mentioned, along with many other mergers, helped Google to amass an incredibly powerful position in ad tech. Right now, I think there's a serious conflict of interest. They are representing publishers and advertisers, and have a significant control of the exchange where publishers and advertisers are meeting in the middle to do their auctions. I think that conflict of interest is very pernicious, and I think we have now reached a point where divestiture is going to be the best solution to promote competition in that very important space.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. We do have a problem here. We've got companies like, well, we've got Google cutting off publishers who don't consent to Google collecting data on web visitors. That's why we need to pass the America Act. The America Act would solve this problem, and among other things, it would create a duty for digital ad companies to act in the best interests of their customers and provide transparencies. I assume we agree on that one, even though we respectfully disagree.
Absolutely.
On the other. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Lee. This has been a very informative hearing on a really